involving a public-private partnership contract for the construction of a light rail system in Korea. And I think this is an interesting case because it represents, I think, what certainly in Korea, and I think probably in Vietnam, are fairly common problems in construction arbitration, and what I think were some creative solutions to those problems. So I'll start by talking about the background of the project at the heart of the dispute, and then the background of what led to the dispute. I'll then discuss the key legal and procedural or practical problems of the arbitration. And I could probably spend at least the full hour talking about the interesting legal issues in the case, but given the limited time, I'll just talk about what really was the core legal question, which is, in Korea, what does it mean for an infrastructure project to be complete? And finally, I'll talk about the practical solutions to the very real need in that case for a swift resolution to at least some of the issues. So this is really what was at the heart of the case. This is a light rail project in a satellite city of Seoul. And the key plan here was to build a really cutting-edge, fully automated, driverless light rail system that would operate on a single line along the core of the satellite city, connecting to the Seoul city metro system, so that residents of the satellite city could ride to work in Seoul entirely on rail. And before this project began, actually about 5 years before bidding for the contract began, the Korea central government commissioned a study to determine if the need for light rail was feasible and what the projected ridership would be. And that formed the basis for this project, to build a system that would meet the projected ridership needs. Ultimately, the winning bidder for the project was a consortium that incorporated a special purpose company comprised of Korean construction firms and a foreign transportation company that had particular expertise in rail systems and rail vehicles. And the method of construction under the implementation agreement between the city and the SPC was to be a build, transfer, operate structure. That is, the SPC would build the system and then upon completion would transfer it to the city and would take over an operation right. And that operation right was the compensation to the SPC. So the city didn't pay a price for the system, they gave an operation right. So the SPC was required to finance the total projected investment amount of approximately $500 million US, and it got its compensation by way of, after transfer, operating for 30 years, and during that 30-year operation period, having a minimum revenue guarantee, which was based on that government study we discussed, or I mentioned, and a percentage of that ridership was guaranteed that if ridership fell below that, the city would compensate the SPC for the lost revenue. Throughout construction, the project ran relatively smoothly, but as completion neared, problems arose because a new study was conducted, and due to changes in other infrastructure, the new projected ridership was only 30 to 50% of the original projection. And it was estimated that the deficiency in ridership would cost the city approximately $75 million US a year in terms of meeting that minimum revenue guarantee. Alongside of that, the city alleged certain defects in construction related to noise complaints, related to periodic flooding at one of the station entrances. So ultimately, when the contractors determined they were complete, the inspectors determined construction was complete, the contractors filed for completion, which would have triggered the transfer obligation and the city's obligation to take over. And the city refused to accept completion and refused to take over the system. And there were 3 completion applications, each of which was refused by the city. And on each case, the city refused to take over the system. So at that point, the SPC terminated the contract for the city's breach of its obligation to accept, transfer, and give the operation right. And this brings into one of the issues is, in the event of termination, if the SPC terminates for the city's default, the SPC was entitled to a termination payment equal to the full investment amount plus the reasonable return on that investment. What in common law we would call expectation damages. The SPC also demanded that the city take over the system so that the SPC no longer needed to incur the cost to maintain. And when the city refused to take over, the SPC decommissioned the system, removed the rail cars from the line, and transferred them to off-site storage. After the SPC's termination, the city responded with their own termination. And if the city's termination was correct, that triggered a different termination payment. Because the city would take ownership, they still were required to pay for the system. But if the city terminated for the SPC's default, the city only had to pay the investment amount, what in common law we would call restitution damages, only what had been paid, and not the extra lost profit. The city also alleged that there were defects that needed to be rectified by the SPC, and the city refused to take over the system until after the defects were identified and after the system was recommissioned and put back into an operational stage. So at this point, with both parties having alleged termination, the case went to arbitration. And the key legal questions were, first, what does it mean for the system to be complete? And that relates to the next question is, who validly terminated it? If the system was complete, then the city breached its obligation to take over the system and allow operation. If the system was not complete, then the SPC breached its obligation to complete construction. Next question was the decommissioning a breach of the agreement, or was it reasonable mitigation? And does the city have to take over the rail line even before it's recommissioned? And finally, what defects were there in the rail system? And we can see here, this is the termination provision for SPC default, and you can see it provides under small Roman 1, the injected private investment amount, that's the cost of the investment, and under 2 is the return on that investment. And there's a similar provision providing if the city terminates for SPC default, it's only the injected private investment amount that's recovered. So those are the legal issues. The practical issues in the arbitration were really threefold. And from the SPC's perspective, the most important of those was that the SPC was almost insolvent. It had been financed through equity financing, through loans from the investors, and from bank loans that were designed to get the SPC through the construction phase into completion. And then on completion, it would refinance on operation loans at lower interest rates. Failing to achieve completion put it in default of the loans, which meant that it was paying interest at rates between 14 and 18% on that $500 million investment amount. And those interest rates would remain in place until it had an arbitration award entitling it to recover so it could refinance at lower rates. On the city's side, their biggest issue was that they alleged defects in the system, but they hadn't taken the system over yet. And the system was decommissioned, so it couldn't be tested to identify the scope of the defects. And finally, complicating everything, the arbitration agreement specifically provided that the award must be issued within 3 months of formation of the tribunal. So to think about what that means, Mr. Kwan helpfully explained how advanced and how quick resolution is at the KCAB, that international arbitrations are generally handled in 11 months on average. At the ICC, that would be 18 months. This provision says that a dispute ranging between $500 million and $750 million US needed to be resolved within 3 months. So we'll start by talking about the legal issue, and then we'll come back to the practical problem. And the legal issue, really at the core, at the heart of the arbitration is, what does it mean to be complete? And Korean law provides, through Supreme Court precedent, that construction is complete if the final phase of construction is completed, the material structures have been constructed in accordance with the agreement, and it's complete in light of social norms and common reasoning. So this doesn't provide a whole lot of specific detail of what does it mean to be complete. Essentially it says, if in light of social norms and good faith it is complete, the construction is complete. And when you look at the contract, essentially it says the works are complete if the inspections are passed, if the contractor, the SPC, issues a completion certificate or a completion report, and if the works meet the technical requirements, the technical specification of the contract. So again, it's hard to say exactly what this means. And on a smaller project, it might be easier to define what complete is. But on a project of this scope, if completion really means absolute compliance with all required specifications, you can't have a hedge or a sidewalk that's part of the design that is not in line, then it's difficult, because as you complete the construction, of course, the construction will deteriorate and need remediation, and it will never be, during the 30-year operation period, will never be perfect. And what we argued and what the tribunal accepted was, what this standard really means is what in common law we call substantial completion. That is, the project is complete when all of the major construction is done. It is prepared to meet the needs of the project and do what it's supposed to do. And if there are defects or other works to be done or problems that arise and need repair, that's a matter of damages or specific performance to remedy those defects. But you can't deny completion for something that is minor and does not interfere with operation. So that was the legal question, and on that basis, the determination was the system's complete. The practical question is, how do we get the SPC to have a right to recover when the issues are so complex and layered one on top of the other? And the answer was a three-phase arbitration. Phase one started with, if the city's termination is right, what is the injected private investment amount? Essentially, what is the minimum termination payment that could be due? And if that amount must be due, then the award should cover that amount. And that's what phase one did. It looked only at what is the injected private investment amount. And the tribunal issued partial final award saying that the contractor is entitled, the SPC is entitled to payment of the injected private investment amount. Phase two looked at, okay, what can we decide before handover of the system? And the easy question there that to identify that can be answered is, whose termination was that? Is the system complete? If the system is complete, what is the additional termination payment to the SPC? And there are also some alleged defects that can be identified before handover. And finally, what are the conditions for handover of the system? How do we move from the position where the SPC has a rail system in its possession that everybody agrees should belong to and be handed over to the city? So that was phase two. And phase three was intended to cover, after handover, and inspection by the city, what additional defects are there that need to be remedied or compensated as damages. And you can see how the phases were run in practice. As a firm, our approach was we set up a team for phase 1, a team for phase 2, and then would have joined the teams for phase 3. Because we operated phase 1 and phase 2 in parallel to get a quicker resolution. So phase 2 started, and at the same time, work was being done on phase 1. Phase 1 had a full hearing and a partial final award, and then phase 2 continued. And we continued to a hearing in phase 2, and you can see in April 2012, the parties reached a settlement. And the settlement was, here are the terms and conditions for how we will put the agreement back together, and the amount will be based on the phase 2 award. So once you get to the second final award in phase 2, phase 3 is no longer necessary, because all of that's been wrapped up in the settlement. And the result here is, between phase 1 of an award of roughly $500 million US, and phase 2 with an award of roughly $250 million US, we were able to handle the case in about 7 months to that first award, and an additional 9 months to the second award. So in total, the 2 phases together were quicker than the average ICC arbitration, and phase 1 was even quicker than the average KCAB international arbitration. And I think what this shows is there's a lot of room for flexibility in arbitration to look at what are the specific legal and factual problems of your case. What complicates the matter for your parties, and how can you find a unique solution to solve those problems?